And we are live. O7s for the thumbnail. O7s in the chat. Thank you all for tuning in to the Barracks, your non-Euclidean network for your pirate radio across the United States and now in Taiwan. We appreciate you for watching on YouTube, on Twitter, soon to be on Rumble whenever Milkman decides to get his army together.
Call me out, why don't you?
That's my job as a host.
Yeah,
and
I'm working
that's
on
my
it.
job as a host, Teray Nasheed. And above me, to my right, we have the co-host with the mo-host. It is your friendly neighborhood Milkman. How you doing, Milk?
I'm doing all right. I feel like we were just streaming, but back on the horse already.
Yeah, we literally are, and we are releasing this pre-recording from the internet because we are dual streaming in Taiwan time, which brings us to our big guest for today. He is the premier anti-imperialist rapper based out of Taiwan. You know him on Twitter as Xiang. How you doing, my friend?
Doing really good. Thank you very much for having me on. You know, I almost couldn't make this show today.
Yeah, you've got some bad voodoo going on.
Yeah, you know, over here it's the seventh month of the Chinese calendar, and that's according to Chinese tradition and folklore, that's when the ghosts and spirits come back to the human realm to I guess enjoy their little summer vacation. And weird things have been happening to me lately. Like the little light I'm using inexplicably broke a few weeks ago, but it's not working again today. When I came home today, I went to Taipei to check out like some leather jackets for a friend in central Taiwan to see like the fits. Because I came home and my computer, like the lights were on, but like it wouldn't post. And luckily within 20 minutes I figured out a fix. I just shifted all the RAM to different slots. So now I'm here, and good to be here.
Yeah, it's funny how some of the biggest communist interviews of the past few weeks have experienced like technical difficulties. There's like all of these weird spiritual conspiracies going on, like with Oliver Anthony getting trapped at Burning Man on the day he was supposed to be interviewed by Midwestern Marks.
So that didn't happen?
He's currently Oliver Anthony is currently trapped in a mud pit in Black Rock, Nevada, surrounded by 73,000 hippies who are coming off of their LSD high. So he had to skip the interview in order to defend his life.
And you said the place is called Black Rock. Yeah,
Black Rock, Nevada. That's where they host Burning Man.
Yeah,
funny, right?
Also the name of that, that bank.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
We did a whole stream about it last night about the weird occult connections with Burning Man.
Weird.
Yeah, we wouldn't make any explicit connections because we don't want the Mossad to put a poison dart in our necks. But hey, we're just noticing things. And so there was that, and it almost happens with Jackson Hinkle's Fresh and Fit collab, because he had previously scheduled it like months ago, and then they canceled, and he only recently rescheduled it for Fresh and Fit, and that collaboration was huge. So it's happening again. The spirit realm is really trying to prevent this mass communist awakening.
That wouldn't make sense over here in Taiwan if you think about it, because if you think about all the people who've been wrong, like who've had like wrongful deaths in like the past century, like a good chunk of them are communists, so they should be protecting me.
And just to get a little bit into Taiwan and your background, before we get into these questions,
yes.
There might be some people, because we have a lot of MAGA people who follow us. Could you give us a bit of your background before we get into
my
these
background?
Questions? Yeah.
All right, so it's kind of funny because when people decided that I'm not the nice woke leftists that they had in mind anymore. They wanted to cancel me and they wanted to label me as a fraud. So then one of the first things they pointed out was, oh, I'm not actually, I didn't actually like grow up in Taiwan. I grew up in America. And it's like, well, you think, listen to the way I talk. But yeah, so I was raised in America, but my mom comes from Taiwan. My dad is part of the Chinese diaspora in Korea, and because and the South Korean government back then did not recognize the children of foreigners, foreign men, as their citizens, even if they're born and raised there. And the only Chinese government they recognized at that point was the one here in Taipei. So people like my dad became so-called ROC citizens. And yeah, so that's my connection with Taiwan. My mom is sixth generation Taiwanese. Her family originated from Zhangzhou, which is in southern Fujian. So we could put to rest the idea that Taiwan was either a barren land until 1949 when Chiang Kai-shek came here, or that it was all indigenous until 1949 when Chiang Kai-shek came here, which I mean, sixth generation, that's a few hundred years. And that should explain the rich history that we have of migrations from the Chinese mainland to Taiwan, and how the two sides of the strait have been connected for a very long time. Yeah.
Yeah, it's almost like the Chinese had very good sailing capabilities and could go to this island that's only a few miles off of the coast.
What's 150 kilometers roughly?
Yeah, so which is like it's about as
Florida,
far
Cuba.
from mainland China as Cuba is from Florida, I think.
Something like that. It's not too far. And on like during various ice ages, the Taiwan Strait actually didn't exist because the sea levels were different. That's why we have like animals and like plants and all that stuff that are like very similar over here to that of southern China and like the southern mainland China. And if you look at human migration patterns, one of the main theories now is that Austronesian peoples originated from what is now like what is now southern China and like on parts of like the Eurasian continent. They came here to Taiwan like tens of thousands of years ago, and then eventually went to the different islands where they are, and those are like basically distant relatives of the indigenous population here in Taiwan. Trade on both sides of the strait has happened for at least like 1,000 years because what's the word? Archaeologists have like uncovered like artifacts from like the Song Dynasty, for example, in Taiwan. So that's happened, and Taiwan, ever since for 400 years, has been formally incorporated into China, first as part of Fujian province as a separate prefecture before becoming its own province in, I believe, 1885. So yeah, Taiwan has been a part of China for much longer than the US has existed as a country. And the fact that we're separated from the mainland right now is actually a historical anomaly if you think about it, you know.
Which is the point, yeah, to like sever all historical ties so that these American-funded fascists in the Kuomintang could like effectively just isolate themselves in this little fortress, which they can't do if they, if the local population sees themselves as historically and ethnically Chinese.
Yeah, and also, what was I going to say? Oh yeah, Taiwan's been separated from the mainland ever since becoming a part of China for a shorter time than Hong Kong was under British rule. I mean, the separation, you can say, began in 1949 because there was a brief period of nominal reunification between 1945 and 1949 when Taiwan was returned to China by Japan. But the Civil War was going on, so the KMT did not really have much time to really govern a unified China. They were busy fighting the Civil War, and there was chaos going on over here. So I think the actual separation really began in 1895 when China lost the Sino-Japanese War and had to give up Taiwan as war reparation. And originally, Li Hongzhang and the Qing government really did not want to go to Taiwan because of its very strategic location, which yeah, I think one question that we could get into is why all the fuss about Taiwan if it's just a little island?
That that's a good question. I mean, you want to answer?
Yeah. So I mean, in history there have been multiple powers that have occupied Taiwan. You had the Dutch and the Spanish and then the Japanese. And the Dutch wanted Taiwan because of its location, like relative to the Chinese mainland, and also because they had their what is it Batavia, which is in modern day Jakarta, their little what is it, Dutch East Indies Company. So it was a very strategic location for trade. The Japanese wanted it because when they were expanding, they wanted to capture mainland China. That was their goal, but they also wanted to expand southward into the Pacific Islands. So Taiwan's location is very important in that regard. The Spanish wanted it because it's close to the Philippines, and this was back when the Philippines was a Spanish colony. And now the U.S. empire really cares about it because I think after World War II, the world was split into a bipolar world order. You know, with the U.S. leading one side and the Soviet Union leading the other, and China as a whole was kind of in an awkward situation. The U.S. wanted to use China as a wedge against the Soviet Union after the communists took power, but before the communists took power, what the U.S. had in mind was we want a unified and big but weak China, and we want that China to play the role that Japan currently plays, which is basically, you know, you had the world order that was like the US led world order, basically had the US as like the center, and it had two wings, one in Europe, which was like Germany, you know, and the other was Japan, kind of managing the situation in the East Asia Pacific region. And Taiwan attitudes kept on changing because you look at the island chains. You got like the Aleutian Islands, you got Japan, you got like the Philippines, you got like, you know, all these islands. They all have governments that are either friendly to the U.S. or have U.S. military bases. After World War II and after the establishment of New China, the U.S. only had two bases on the Asian continent, South Korea and South Vietnam. And you look at Taiwan's location, it's close to both. It's an integral part of the island chain. It's MacArthur called it the aircraft carrier that can't be sunk. And from mainland China's perspective, it is basically the gate into the Pacific. And so the U.S. plan at that point was, okay, we kind of want to use Taiwan as a thorn in the side of the CPC because we still kind of want to enter negotiations with the CPC to get them, you know, to kind of drive a wedge in the socialist camp against the Soviet Union. And but at the same time, it's like, okay, this Chiang Kai-shek guy, he's not really reliable. He lost the Civil War. We supported him after World War II, and he couldn't defeat the communists, and he's corrupt. And we tried to oust him a few times in Taiwan, but he outsmarted us. And yeah, so we're going to support him, but we're also going to support the separatists who he's against. Just so we use the separatists as like the thorn in the side of Chiang Kai-shek's, you know, like rule, and then we use Chiang Kai-shek as like the thorn in the side of the CPC. That was
to hedge their bets, yeah.
Basically, yeah. So I think one of your questions was hey, the KMT was historically like the enemy of the CPC, but how come they're seen as like the lesser evil today, or something along those lines, right?
Yeah, well, that's not where separatism's coming from, right? I mean, I can pull up this tweet of yours.
Yeah,
because you mentioned something about how the history is being distorted, and these are separatists who are calling for decolonization, which is a very familiar phrase for us. So, yeah, I was just curious.
Gunter Fellinger loves that phrase.
Yeah, decolonize everywhere, every man a nation. So, yeah, I wanted to ask you what form separatism was taking. Who are the sort of social forces that make this coalition? And where's this ideology coming from?
I think there are many sources of this, the sources of this ideology. One of the main parts, so like the KMT, it wasn't really for separatism, but it did pave the path for it. The fact that, okay, Chiang Kai-shek lost the Civil War, he refused to surrender to the CPC, but at the same time, like, he had this point of unity with Mao, which is, okay, we're separate, but this is like the result of this is unfinished business that's internal to our country. But then you let that drag on long enough, that's people have short memories sometimes, and there are forces out there that are more than willing to take advantage of these contradictions. One of the forces is, well, when the KMT ruled Taiwan, because let's go back a little bit.
Yeah,
further.
Just to clarify for the audience, the Kuomintang in Taiwan, literally just a unbroken continuation from the Kuomintang from the Chinese Civil War that just went over to the island. Yeah, and it's the same. The flag is the same.
Oh yeah. So here's a point to make. People say Taiwan is an independent country, but okay, when was independent Taiwanese Republic declared? And don't talk about, in 1895 there was this Republic of Formosa that was declared. That was declared by Chinese patriots who did not want Taiwan to fall to the Japanese, and yeah, they were defeated by the Japanese very quickly. But yeah, they were loyal to the Qing. Their era name, because in Chinese, like in traditional Chinese culture, like instead of using like the Gregorian year, you have like the era name, which usually, like, Japan still does it. It's like the year of like year 5 of so and so emperor or whatever. The era name during the Republic of Formosa in 1895 was Yongqing, which means forever Qing. Qing as in the Qing dynasty. So they were, yeah. So when was a independent Taiwanese Republic ever declared? Ever since in like the 20th century or the 21st century? Never. Chiang Kai-shek, when he came to Taiwan, it wasn't like, oh, I'm gonna go there and establish a new country. No, it was, okay, this is the last part of my country that hasn't fallen to the communists, from his perspective. And from the communist perspective, it's like, okay, we've gotten most of the country under our control. There's just one part of our country that's still under his control, but we've got enough of it that the tide's not turning back. We can declare the new dynasty, for lack of a better term, to have been established, and it's only a matter of time before reunification will happen. You look at the establishment of any new dynasty and in China, you see similar trends. Like the CPC did not just exist in 1949; it existed long before it existed, since the 1920s. But it did not. But the PRC was not established until 1949. Even in 1949 there were large territories on the mainland that were still under KMT control. But that's like the point where it's like, okay, the trends are set. The country is firmly in our hands. The Taiwan issue, we can wait. That's just a little tiny. That's an internal matter, and it was gonna be, Mao was going to send forces to here to liberate Taiwan in like 1950, but then the Korean War broke out, and the breaking out of the Korean War was what got Truman to reconsider his options, because at first they were just like, okay, let's wait and see. This Chiang Kai-shek guy, he already lost to the communists, and we do not want to alienate the communists in China, because maybe we could drive a wedge against the Soviet Union with them. So yeah,
and that was also the start in a very big way with Korea, with the strategy of encirclement for mainland China. Like, South Korea is one of the most militant and one of the older like U.S. military bases functionally to encircle the continent.
I think so sorry I got sidetracked, but what I was trying to say is under Japanese rule, so Japan ruled Taiwan from 1895 until 1945. There was like the local landed aristocracy, and Japan kind of secured their rule by winning those people over and having them take care of like a lot of local day-to-day stuff. And and then there was this movement towards the end of like Japan's occupation of Taiwan, which was if you wanted to become like a formal subject of the emperor, you go through this ceremony and you have to meet certain criteria. You have to speak Japanese at home. You have to practice Shintoism. You have to like live according to Japanese customs and all that stuff. you go through a ceremony where you renounce your Chinese ancestors and adopt new fake Japanese ancestors. And roughly 2% of Taiwan's population went through that process. Only 2%. And most of those came from the landed aristocracy or like the burgeoning like bourgeois industrial like capitalist or like banker class, like those sorts of people. So there is that sort of class element. And but the thing is, when the KMT came, Chiang Kai-shek learned some pretty difficult lessons on the mainland. But on the mainland, he was beholden to like, you know, the feudal landlords and those people. He couldn't piss them off because that's where he derived a lot of his power from. But on Taiwan, he had no such relation with the local landed aristocracy. So he was like, okay, we're gonna carry out land reform because I don't want to get fucked over again by communists wanting land reform. So we're gonna carry out land reform, and it's gonna help us rebuild this war-torn economy, because Taiwan was also war-torn as a result of World War II. It was air raided, and yeah, we're gonna do that. And also, because the country is now in a state of disunity, I'm gonna suspend elections beyond the local level. So what that means is you had like the National Assembly, and back then the old system under the Republic of China is you elect like the people elect like the representatives in the National Assembly. The National Assembly elects the president. Now with elections suspended, Chiang Kai-shek could keep on like getting the assembly to appoint him as leader. So, and then the people in the National Assembly, they were elected in 1948, by the way, through a rubber stamp election on the mainland. They kind of just stayed unchanged until the 1980s. And they were all like elites from the mainland. So there was this sort of feeling of the KMT came and there are a bunch of out of touch elites from the mainland. Yeah, so those people dominated like the higher levels of government, and then the local government was dominated by local Taiwanese. And when I say local Taiwanese and mainlanders, what I mean is local Taiwanese are people whose families have already been in Taiwan by like 1945 or 1895. People who've been here for like generations. Someone like my mom, she's like 6th generation, so she's like local Taiwanese. We call them 本省人, which means people of this province. Whereas like people like Chiang Kai-shek, they're called or like the soldiers who came along with him, like the 2 million soldiers that came in 1949, they're called, and their descendants, they're called 外省人, which means extra provincial people. So like the extra provincials dominated high levels of government. The locals dominated like local, city governments, except with the exception of Taipei and Kaohsiung, because Taipei and Kaohsiung were elevated to the status of provincial level cities. So the provincial level cities and the provincial governor, they were also appointed like non-democratically. So there was this feeling of, oh man, this is where like the idea of that, we're colonized by the mainlanders came from, or colonized by like separatists will be like, we're colonized by Chinese people came from. But then it's like, okay, but then like your ancestors also came from the mainland. Where are you going to say they colonized Taiwan? And some people are starting to lean that way as well. But then it's like, okay, when the first Han people came from the mainland to Taiwan, a lot of them came because they were like basically bought by the Dutch as cheap laborers. The Dutch who colonized certain parts of Taiwan. And so it's like, is it fair to call them colonizers? And also like there were like 300 different tribes that were unassociated with one another. Where do you get permission to enter Taiwan from? And also a lot of the land was like unsettled, and yeah, so it's like, how do you get into that? It's not like, it wasn't really a case of like people from the mainland coming here generations ago and just slaughtering indigenous people. It was more like, actually a lot of Han people here are assimilated indigenous in the plains areas. What happened was you had like intermarriages and a lot of mutual reliance and trade. And they found a lot of like local indigenous and plains areas found like the Chinese way of organizing society was, quite developed and pretty useful. Also, the fact that there's a written language, so they started adopting it. Yeah, so it's like the whole decolonization thing that also kind of has its roots over there. Now you had those people who were kind of, the local landed aristocracy. They felt screwed over because under Japanese rule, they enjoyed a lot of privileges. And then Chiang Kai-shek comes and he's just like, yeah, fuck you, or we're just redistributing your land, and you're not going to have much of a say in higher levels of government. So yeah, around that time, before the Japanese left, they had like meetings in like Taipei, you know, talking about like starting a Taiwan separatist movement. And the whole purpose of separatism from the beginning was, I mean, why were Japanese people involved in it? If it were truly independence, then it should be coming from the grassroots, not with like, you know, people, elites, like kind of manipulating these things. And a really interesting fact is, until the 1980s, Taiwan separatism as a movement did not really exist much within Taiwan because it was really suppressed. Most of its activities were abroad, first in Japan, but then increasingly in America. Yeah, that's where you have like organizations like FAPA. I think it's like the Formosan American like pub. Let me look it up. FAPA, Formosan Association for Public Affairs. Yeah, that was like basically like their little organization in America. And it's like, yeah, the US was supporting Chiang Kai-shek, but it was also like tacitly supporting these groups. And it was a good look to support these groups because Chiang Kai-shek and his son Jiang Jingguo did rule Taiwan as like a dictatorship, as like a martial law thing. So like supporting them would have just been like, oh yeah, we're supporting their democracy. And yeah, but basically it's just to make sure that the wedge between Taiwan and the mainland remain, and that they somehow have the Zhang family by the balls.
Yeah, it's this decolonization process. It always starts from another country, doesn't it? Like it's the same thing even in the Western Hemisphere with places like Brazil.
Yeah.
You have like France is doing a lot of work to try and like to deindustrialize the Amazon regions, and you have people from Austria like Gunther Fellinger, who always makes these weird decolonized. Now he's a NATO Nazi, like he's an actual like NATO war hawk, borderline Nazi individual who like makes all these decolonized maps about what China will look like when this you know, the Chinese.
It's funny
party.
because those people will say like, oh, you guys are fascists who want an ethno state, but it's like those maps actually are ethno states.
And it's always originating from an outside country, and it's this dark reversal of communist and development, or historical development in general. But communist development, which turns that process into overdrive, like puts it into overdrive.
To Stalin.
Yeah, just to centralize development. Yeah, that's Gunther Fellinger's Nazi map of Brazil. And he did the same thing to Russia. He did the same thing to China. All BRICS countries, by the way. You know,
China maps are kind of funny though. It's just like like Manchuria. It's like you go to northeastern China. Ask anyone if they think they are not Chinese. They all think they're Chinese, and like yeah, some of them are like, I guess by nationality they're like, or like ethnicity they're Manchu, but they think of that as like secondary to their Chinese identity.
Right, and so all they need to do is, like you said, 2% of the population went through the process in Taiwan of like thinking that they're Japanese, and that's all they would need is 2%. They just need to find the 2% fringe group that agrees with this mass psychosis, and then put them in political power in all of these different fractured ethno-states.
Let them run
rather than having these unrelated groups be developed by a central federal government, which we've seen as nothing but like a benefit to humanity all over the world. So it's that sort of federal process of development in reverse.
It's funny because in all other countries you're like, oh, we don't want borders, but then it's like with these countries they somehow want a bunch of like heavily enforced internal borders. And what I wanted to go on and say is I think what I'm trying to say is Taiwan separatism is like it's like a merger. You have like local like opportunist compradors and like basically opportunists who support Taiwan separatism for their own purposes, like working in like using the imperialists to further their gains, and you have like the Western imperialists using them to further their geopolitical goals. And at 1980s was when like there was like the liberal opposition movement against the Kuomintang, which the current incumbent party, the Democratic Progressive Party, the DPP, was born out of. And basically all of those separatists who were exiled from Taiwan up until then, towards the end of the opposition movement, the ban on opposition parties was lifted, and those people started coming back to Taiwan en masse, joining the DPP. But the thing is, are they really like in touch with the people in Taiwan, were they? Because a lot of them had been abroad for like 30 years. They hadn't like lived in they hadn't lived in Taiwan during those times. It's just they're using identity politics, and like during that time, one of my friends, his dad was in his 20s, I believe, when this happened. Was so yeah, there, I mean, you had incidents like the 228 incident in 1947, which, like, you know, like great tragedy. You had like soldiers like coming in from the mainland by the KMT, like shooting people up to quash this like kind of chaos that happened because of misunderstandings between local Taiwanese and mainlanders, whatever. Oh yeah, by the way, it's not some people like to present that as like Han on indigenous violence, because they're operating from the assumption that everyone in Taiwan up until then was indigenous, which was not. It was indigenous people were like almost not involved in that at all. But yeah, that you have that sort of incident. But then by the 1980s, it's like, okay, whatever, we're all living here. You know, we have some different family roots. We have like, we hail from like different provinces, but we're here, we're working together, whatever. But then like once that liberal opposition movement came into overdrive, now all of a sudden you had people who were like who would go like out on the streets, like those activists, and like speak to you in Hokkien, what people call Taiwanese, but it's actually like the Taiwanese variant of Southern Minnan dialect from, again, which it's still from the mainland. Like speaking that as opposed to standard Mandarin, just to see if like you're actual like local Taiwanese, or if you're like from if you're like a more recent, if your family came from the mainland, they would do those sorts of things and start like and harass people for, you know, having more recent roots on the mainland. So it's like ID poll dividing the people, because like, okay, 2% of the population, most people are like, you know, working class, their interests are not aligned with theirs, but they have, how do you win them over? Well, it's easy. Like the majority of people in Taiwan are you know, are Bensenren. Like only like around like what 15% of the population is like descends from like the migrations that happened after 1945 until like the 1950s. So it's like, okay, let's make this about like a group of out of touch mainlanders ruling over us. And you know, some people, it's you can win some sympathy, because I mean, there was a lot of bullshit that people don't like government. People don't like government getting into their shit. And it's like, it happens that a lot of these higher level officials are mainlanders, and you're like local Taiwanese, you're just like, oh, that fucking like yeah.
Yeah, and that's a good segue, because we appreciate this level of depth for historical context, because people all over the world have very short memories when they're being flooded with especially with U.S. propaganda. But we're officially past the halfway mark for the hour. That's how long these pre-recorded streams can be to re-upload them. So I think halfway is good for historical context. Let's move it into the modern times.
One more thing, though. Just one last thing before we get into that. So basically, Jiang Jingguo, Chiang Kai-shek's son, wanted to shed the KMT of the image of being a bunch of out-of-touch mainlanders. So he started promoting some local Taiwanese like into higher levels of government. One of them being Li Denghui. That's LEETENG-HUI. Yeah, he's local Taiwanese, but he was also one of those people who went through that ceremony to become like a official Japanese subject. That's why you had this this idea that, oh, people are like that because they're secretly like leftovers from Japan. No, most Japanese people were repatriated in 1945. These people are worse. They're actual like national traitors. So yeah, he had promoted him up to higher levels of government, and then at one point he was like the vice leader, so-called vice president. And then Jiang Jingguo died in 1988, and he took over the he finished his term and then got reelected, became KMT chairman, and then fully liberalized Taiwan. And the U.S. supported him, like the U.S. supported like the liberal faction of the KMT over the Bonapartist faction, like represented by Hao Bo-chun. And at the same time, it was also supporting like the DPP, like liberal opposition movement outside of the KMT. So you have a totally liberalized Taiwan today. So much for they call it Taiwan independence, but clearly, like the more the deeper you go, like somehow you're more like cooked by the U.S.
Yeah, you're not even Taiwanese anymore. You're Japanese.
Yeah, I haven't been able to find it, but there was a speech I saw a little bit ago from Tsai Ing-wen where she was saying, if we get invaded by China, we'll lose our feminism and LGBT rights and like indigenous rights.
Can you
And
explain who that is to the audience?
Oh,
Oh
that's
yeah,
the
that's
current
we.
president.
It's fear mongering to wokes because
Right.
it's I think one of your later questions has to do with this, but basically the DPP got like a huge woke makeover in like 2014 when there was that color revolution called the Sunflower Movement. Basically, there was the leadership then Ma Ying-jeou wanted to sign a trade agreement which would have like further integrated Taiwan's economy with the mainland's, and it became there became like a student protest movement. They went and occupied the parliamentary building, and a lot of people entered politics as like student activists, and now they're like the new generation of DPP leaders. And that's when like the woke washing and like the like it's funny because the DPP, like these people, they call themselves like leftists pretty much. So you can see similar things happening in America with like, you know, wokes like reinforcing the status quo. So yeah, the DPP hasn't had much like policy victories. Like the economy stagnant. If you remove TSMC from the picture, economic growth is negative. But what they have been doing is increasing Taiwan's visibility in Western media and making the youth feel proud of being Taiwanese, because you have like a bunch of like Western wokes like, oh, Taiwan is so progressive. They like allow this, and that. But it's okay. Women's rights. I mean, what women's rights are there over here that mainlanders don't have? LGBT rights. Okay, you can talk about like same-sex marriage over here, but was that a democratic gain? Because most people, there was a referendum, and referendums over here are just like done to like kind of gauge where the public is at. They're not legally binding, but a responsible government would look at the results of a referendum and be like, okay, maybe we should respect the wishes of the people and act in accordance. They had a referendum on same-sex marriage, and people overwhelmingly voted against it. so then Taiwan administration was like, okay, you know what? I'm going to do a special law. We're just going to legalize it anyways. So then it's okay. You can call it like a victory of like progress or whatever, but it's not a victory of democracy. People did not want that. And people aren't necessarily against it out of like homophobia or whatever. It's just, you know, especially people in rural areas are just not ready to deal with that stuff. If you want people to accept it, you gotta go in and integrate yourself into the masses and like give them your case. And
yeah, they don't want a dude in a dress on their beer can when they're just trying to barbecue.
yeah. And then like indigenous rights. Okay, well, the mainland's done much better on like rights like regarding like protecting like the languages, the cultures of national minorities and shit like that. Like you look at like the first Tibetan typewriter, it was developed by the CPC. Those languages have like Tibetan has legal status in the Tibetan autonomous region. The
Tibetan farmers are no longer enslaved to the Dalai Lama's family.
Yeah, the Uyghur language, it has official status in the Xinjiang Uyghur autonomous region. Like you have places like Yanbian. Yanbian is the population is there is a Korean population in China, but they've been there for like hundreds of years, so they count as a Chinese minority. They're not like Korean, like as in like having to do with like the modern Korean state, but they're like, you know, their roots are Korean. They're called Chaoxianzu in Chinese, or Zhozhenzuok in Korean. Yeah, Korean has official status in the Yanbian Korean Autonomous Prefecture up in Jiling Province. Yeah, none of the indigenous languages here in Taiwan have like official status in like regions in Taiwan, and it's just like, yeah, it's a bunch of like feel good like ID poll stuff. That's like they do these things, but then are they really improving the lives of these people? And it's like, no. Whereas you see poverty alleviation on the mainland, you see like people in those regions becoming like more like integrated into the rest of society while preserving their cultural particularities and shit like that. So it's yeah, it's fear mongering. It's out of it. She's preying on the ignorance of that young people have towards the Chinese mainland, because the educational curriculum in Taiwan before then, even during the most anti-communist days, it was alt Chinese patriotism. It's like, yeah, we hate the CPC, but China's forever, the CPC's temporary. We're proud Chinese people. We're gonna, like, people like my mom had to like learn like what provinces like the Yangtze River passes through, what's the highest point in China, what's like the biggest like freshwater like body of water in China, like what's the population of like Guizhou province, what's the what's the area of like Liaoning province and stuff like that. And that was kind of de-emphasized after Chen Shui-bian was elected in 2000. So you have like a generation, like people who are younger than me, or people who are my age, who are 30, they grew up under that curriculum. They don't like just separated from like the rest of China. And because you look at education in America, you go to first grade, what do you learn about? You learn about like Benjamin Franklin.
How to chop your balls off.
What? Sorry.
In America, in first grade, you learn how to chop your balls off.
Okay, yeah, but back in more simpler days, you have you learn about like the like your roots and stuff, like the roots of the country and whatever. And yeah, in Taiwan it used to be you start learning about Chinese shit, but now it's like you de-emphasize that, and it's like very like Taiwan centric. Whereas like in the past, it wasn't like okay, we're just going to deny Taiwan like its own like identity or whatever. It's a regional identity, but it's like Taiwanese culture back then was seen as like a subset of Chinese culture, whereas like today it's like the way they try to twist it is, oh, Taiwanese culture is a mishmash of all sorts of different cultures because we've been colonized by the Dutch, the Spanish, and we have indigenous people, and we've been colonized by the Japs. So sorry, I'm allowed to say that. Chinese people can say Japs if like yeah. We've been colonized by the Japanese, so it's our Taiwanese culture is very special because it's a combination of all of this. And it's like, bitch, you look at any part of like culture on the Chinese mainland, and it's like every region has its own regional particularities. So that's not a good argument. Like you go to
for an American audience, it's really important because we here at the Barracks want to make sure that we respect the sovereignty of like other countries, but really like but also understand that these ideas are not foreign. Like a Hamiltonian level like federal system is exactly like the kind of thing that is like it's very similar to what's going on in China. Like this, it's to bring all of these different regions under a singular developmental path to avoid things like civil war, to avoid things like foreign interference, to avoid things like bureaucracy, and because of all these like border disputes and tariffs and trade between like neighbors who are on the same like civilizational path. And even with the 13 original colonies of the United States, that they were all of similar ethnic stock. They all spoke English. They all had very similar histories. They were still afraid of foreign interference and civil war. Like that was a very real fear for them because of how much struggle went on. So this is not some alien idea.
Yeah. For
a country that's less than 250 years old, as opposed to a civilization that's thousands of years old. Like that. So where tensions are even more stark. Like that sort of necessity of a federally recognized development that gives autonomy to the different regions is not some like authoritarian idea. It's a political necessity.
And you've noticed like the U.S. position on the whole Taiwan issue has been back and forth. Like when Nixon and Kissinger were visiting China. Like they were reiterating, the U.S. recognizes that there is one China and that Taiwan is a part of China, which seems like some sort of huge breakthrough, but not really, because in 1945 at Potsdam and Cairo, or towards the end of World War II, not necessarily 1945, the U.S. and Soviet Union and like the great powers were like discussing like post-war plans, and the idea was Japan would relinquish its territories gained through unequal treaties, though Taiwan would be returned to China. And then Korea would be made independent, but the thing is, Japan didn't sign its peace treaty until 1950, and the U.S. by design left China out of signing the peace because there was like, okay, well, do we invite Beijing or do we invite Taipei to sign the treaty? So the U.S. by design left them out, and then had Japan sign a separate treaty with Chiang Kai-shek in the Treaty of Taipei. So then the U.S. could be like, well, the status of Taiwan is actually undetermined. We don't recognize Taiwan as having been returned to China. It's just undetermined. And Chiang Kai-shek was just kind of in charge of running things. That's like the legal justification that separatists have of their separatism. But then it's like the way the Cairo declarations, the Potsdam declarations, or communiques or whatever are referenced in like following treaties, and the way they're filed in the UN like records make them legally binding. And the UN recognizes the PRC as a successor state of the ROC. So whatever that calls itself the ROC today is really just a rump state left over. It's internal, is China's internal matter. So yeah, it's not about like China expanding and trying to take something that isn't theirs. It's, if you look at history, like I said, Taiwan being separate from China after its integration into China for like 400 years is a historical anomaly.
This is a question. This was on the list, but I'm actually very curious about this. I want to get your take on it.
Yeah.
So these are the countries that recognize Taiwan as independent and have no relations with.
No, actually, they don't recognize Taiwan as an independent country. What they recognize is the Republic of China as the Chinese government.
Oh, okay. All right.
So even then, they don't recognize Taiwan as a. Well, the thing is, what's called the Republic of China, it's the government on Taiwan. The PRC does not recognize the ROC, obviously. And the ROC doesn't legally recognize the PRC, so it's like kind of like North and South Korea don't recognize each other. They consider themselves like one country. But the problem is, this kind of worked in Taiwan. You have like two governments that both claim to be the legitimate Chinese government, but now you have like separatists who worm their way into this government, which makes things really confusing. But yeah, these countries, you look at them, they're all poor countries. Basically, a
really random assortment of like Kiribati. Stop the presses. Kiribati has something to say.
Well, a lot of them are in South America and the Caribbean.
Yeah, but this is interesting. The Vatican recognizes the ROC, and we are IQ pilled on this show, of course. So,
well, 1942, it was still the ROC.
The Italian question is real. Yeah. The Italian question.
Do you know what's going on with the Vatican here?
I don't know, but I think 1942, that was when that was when the ROC was still the legitimate government of all of China, so they just didn't shift recognition. I don't know. As for the reasons, I don't understand it. It's not something I've really gotten into. But for the rest of the countries, the reason is because they're offered aid by the administration here in Taiwan to keep recognizing the so-called ROC instead of the PRC.
Yeah, a lot of
one China policy means you can only recognize one China, which is, so if you recognize the so-called ROC, okay, that's the one China you recognize. We're not going to fuck with you. Oh, that's the PRC perspective.
Yeah, I think Tuvalu has like 50,000 people or something. It's like a tiny country in Oceania. So yeah, you know, very
no more tiny countries, especially not tiny island countries. These tiny island countries. We are seeing a pattern here.
Yeah.
Taiwan is just the most egregious example. No more tiny island nations. Integrate them into mainland superpowers, because
they don't recognize, like you said, like I just really want to reiterate. I know I said this already. They don't recognize Taiwan as an independent country because not even the administration here in Taiwan recognizes Taiwan as an independent country. Like under our legal framework, it's the Republic of China, which contains the free area being Taiwan province and Yanjiang County of Fujian province and Jinmen County of Fujian province. There are actually parts of Fujian province under the so-called ROC rule still today. So yeah, even the government here does not legally recognize the Taiwan as an independent country. It's just the separatists, in order to like as like some sort of lip service to their separatist voters. They're like, oh, we don't need to declare independence because we're already an independent country, and the name of our independent Taiwan is called the Republic of China. But if you read the DPP's like political platform, like one of the first things is we want to abolish the ROC and replace it with the ROT. So even they're reneging on their promises. It's a bunch of, as you can see, it's a bunch of it's a mishmash of ideologies, but a bunch of contradictions. But behind it all is a world order that is vested in maintaining its geopolitical interests. So it uses these people to further its goals. That's the best way to summarize it. And the same people who are behind China's continued separation are the same people. I want to tell this to the American audience. They're the same people who are leaving Americans neglected, leaving the infrastructure rotting, letting people be homeless when there's a lot of work to be done, you know, like fixing up the infrastructure, like fixing the education program. and it's letting the people turn to crackheads, letting their sisters, mothers, wives, and daughters become like whores on OnlyFans and labeling that as empowerment. It's the same people who are doing that.
Yeah,
Well,
and that's a really good comparison, which we always need to see how these things are connected. It's not some grand conspiracy to say that that the powerful forces, the rich men north of Richmond in Washington D.C., who are doing this to our own American citizens. It's not a stretch to say that they're creating creating these conditions in other countries. In fact, using other countries as the laboratory for those policies to enforce elsewhere. So
I think, to tie this in, why the U.S. will want to do this is because, I mean, after the war, there was this sort of like, you had two competing world orders, and then the U.S. had this sort of value chain, this sort of global economy that ran alternative to the Soviets, which was as the economy grows bigger, you can't the supply chain can't really just be contained to one country. So like places like Taiwan, they got in where they fit in, and it's like, okay, we're good at making chips, or before then it wasn't chips, it was more like shoes and stuff like that. Well, we're gonna do this and we're gonna make ourselves prosperous. But now it's like, oh shit, there's this alternative chain that's emerging, and the contradictions in the U.S. economy have gotten to a point where, in order for monopolists, the Wall Street bankers, to maintain their supplies, they're actively trying to destroy this value chain and cause them degrowth and deindustrialization so they can maintain their monopoly positions. The last thing they want is, on this value chain, you have countries emerging and like they got rich from it, and now they're setting up their alternatives, and they can decouple from the U.S., or they can start trading with like Russia in rubles, or mainland China with the yuan, and it devalues the U.S. currency. And then it's like, oh shit, the U.S. currency is fiat currency. It's backed by nothing except for trust in the government, and it's only valuable if valuable commodities like oil and chips are traded in it. And if there's an alternative that comes up and it loses values, and not only that, debts will no longer be issued in U.S. dollars, and we can't just pay debts by printing dollars. So the bigger issue is the same people causing these issues and are causing the deindustrialization in America. And you need industrialization in a real economy for the people to be prosperous and enjoy good lives. It's not really a matter of, we don't like the Russians, the Chinese are out to get us, so if we defeat them, everything will be good. It's like, no, a lot of the issues in America are the elites doing it to themselves, or doing it to maintain their positions of dominance at the expense of the people.
What?
Yeah, you oh wait, hold on. I muted you, Teray, because you got a little noise pollution coming through. But you mentioned education, and it does sound a lot like the Ukraine playbook just playing out in Taiwan. Like in Ukraine, they learn it's like a 5,000-year-old country, and they dug out the Black Sea and invented the wheel and domesticated the chicken or whatever. And it really does seem like it's pretty successful. I mean, Ukrainians they really hate Russia. So it seems like the same kind of playbook playing out. But there is one guy who just announced for president who says he does not want Taiwan to be the new Ukraine. Terry Guo. I'll read this quote. Taiwan must not become Ukraine, and I will not let Taiwan become the next Ukraine. I implore the Taiwanese people to give me 4 years. I promise I will bring 50 years of peace to the Taiwan Strait. So what do you think about this guy? You think he's legit, or is he being cynical, or what's the deal with him? This is the CEO of Fox.
I think there is some legitimacy to what he's saying, because I don't know if you know Foxconn, the factories are on the mainland. He has business interests on the mainland. Now the way the separatists will demonize him is say, oh, he has business interests on the mainland, so his loyalties to Taiwan are challenged, and plus his family came from the mainland, like like post-war. So yeah, but I mean, he's part of, capitalists are split into two ends. That you have like two camps. You have like the capitalists who are productive. They make their money by engaging in the real economy. That's him. He manufactures stuff, and then you have like finance capital that make money off of speculation and that sort of stuff. He falls into the former camp, and mainland China's developmental path is also like congruent with his personal goals. Like let's not talk about like his whole like ideology or his loyalties. It's just his interests. He has vested interests in maintaining a stable cross-strait situation and allowing, mainlanders to invest in Taiwan, and more importantly, Taiwanese people to invest in the mainland and let their businesses run like as usual on the mainland. I also want to point out something. You talk about the activists and the middle class activists in Taiwan that are like the stormtroopers of the separatists. A good portion of them actually have parents who got rich on the mainland after they opened up, and they do business on the mainland. They were brought up with the RMB, the Chinese currency, the mainland Chinese currency, and they're trying to they're trying to destroy what fed them.
And and for our last 4 minutes here for the pre-recording, for our closing statements, so we have industrial capitalists like this trying to at least wrest power from the separatists, but do you see any mass anti-imperialist sections of the population at large or within the government?
Not in the government, I would say, but I think because right now I'm a conscript. I'm not in the military, but I'm doing alternative service. I'm serving in central Taiwan in a rural area. I wouldn't say it's like an active anti-imperialism, but it's like this proto anti-imperialist sentiment. And I went to a restaurant once to buy food for new conscripts. It's our tradition there. Like, yeah. And I would just talk to the owner there, and he was like, "Oh, you're doing a conscription right now." I'm like, "Yeah." And he's talked about war in Ukraine and how he's worried that Taiwan will do the unthinkable and become the next Zelensky. So I just blurted out. I was like Zelensky is a bastard who's selling out his country. He's a whore of Wall Street and Washington. And the owner was just like, yeah, and I just don't want Taiwan to become that. I don't want people here to become cannon fodder. And so there is that sort of sentiment. And he's basically saying, yeah, I don't see how any of this benefits us. It's clearly to benefit like outside forces that he doesn't quite understand. He says he doesn't quite understand, but he sees it. He's like, we're being used by he said 美国爸爸, which means like Daddy America. So it's is that anti-imperialism? I mean, maybe it's not fully developed anti-imperialism, but it's like the start. It's the seeds are being planted, and
that's very interesting.
When people engage in politics with their hearts, that's not when it really matters. What really starts mattering is when people engage in politics with their stomachs, which yeah, if tensions rise and the administration here doesn't fix things and wages continue to become being stagnant while inflation gets out of control, like, what do you think people care about more? Their kids' futures, feeding their families, or some sort of ideal that they're not willing to even die for?
That is a phenomenal summary. There you have it, folks. Clip it, wrap it, put a bow on it. I think that's very relevant for all of these countries experiencing the same level of conflict that is backed by Western powers, whether it's Taiwan, Ukraine, now with ECOWAS forming this war bloc against Niger, and even with talks of national divorce in the United States. Like, these people, when people start thinking with their stomachs and who can actually provide that central level of development, that's who's going to lead them. And with that, we are approaching the 1 hour mark for this interview. We really appreciate y'all for who are watching on YouTube, those who are watching on Twitter, where we are blowing it up. We are going viral. And we appreciate you, Xiang, for joining us today.
Yeah, thank you for having me on.
Yeah, and make sure to like and subscribe. Make sure to follow Xiang on Twitter @NotXiangYu. You can see the handle there on the tag. And for the last 30 seconds, Milkman, you got anything to say for the last 30 seconds?
Yeah, just drop a follow if you want to follow what's going on in Taiwan. There's nobody better.
All right, share it up, y'all, because that's all we got. We're out.